Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stories That Shape Us podcast. For the last couple of days, I've been talking about the abuse scandal in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and in the Church of England. And today in the podcast, I'm going to look at just the differences between the two churches and how they've dealt with it, how different leaders in different denominations have dealt with abuse. I'm going to look at some of the questions that I see people ask, some of the statements that I see people make that sometimes can be very damaging and harmful to victims. But I don't think people care about that. They're more so wanting to protect the denomination than it is to look after victims. So some of the questions and statements such as, why did they take so long? Why are they coming now? The incident didn't happen in the church. I hear some of the leaders say that in the statements that they make. They kept repeating the fact that it didn't happen in the church. And also, why did people engage with the media? Don't talk to the media. And I'm also going to look at some of the differences between the Church of England and the Seventh-day Adventist Church and some of the things that we can learn from this moving forward. Because one of the things that I'm not hearing from the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the lessons that we've learned and how we're going to implement them. Because I think maybe there's a fear of talking to the media. So after the safeguarding statements that have gone out, the poor responses and letters that have gone out, we've not heard anything else from them. And I've always said this, sometimes I think our church is so out of touch with its members that it can't know that so many people are angry, so many people are very deeply hurt, and people need answers, but we're not getting any of those things. So let's talk about it, some of the things that I've just said. I want to look at some of the differences between the responses between the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the Church of England. Accountability is one thing that I've seen. I've seen where the Church of England has taken accountability. They've recognized the failings of leadership and they've taken responsibility. Now, some of the bishops called for the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he has resigned from his position. Now, we don't know. Maybe that's political. Maybe it's, funding issues. Maybe it's one of the things I know, though, is that it will go a long way in restoring faith in the institution. And so people can start to say, okay, people are taking responsibility. And one of the things we've seen on the news again is that they are bishops calling for other resignation, And so for me, it looks like leadership is holding other leadership responsible for failings. We have not seen anything like that in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, not a word from anyone. And maybe because I see why did the victims talk to the media? And there's an aversion to the media. I know why, it's not always honest. The reporting is not always honest. The reporting can be biased. And so there's a fear of perhaps talking to the media. But I think it would do a lot in restoring some kind of trust and faith. When I watched the news, I saw the safeguarding lead for the Church of England giving an interview. I don't know who the safeguarding lead is for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and this is where I worship. And so who is the safeguarding lead, and why aren't they talking to people and telling us what's happening? Why aren't they letting us know what's going on? And I think one of the reasons, and these are my reasons, these are my opinions. This is not opinions of the church in any way. These are just my opinions, right? One of the thing is, because they keep stressing this in all the letters, and I don't know it's for legal responsibilities. It's a long time ago time. It happened in the 60s and 70s. It's a long time ago. And what they fail to understand, I think, is that though abuse of that nature happened in the 60s and 70s, the repercussions would be felt in 2024, right? We're here. We saw those men on the television screen weeping, that gentleman crying. So it doesn't matter how long ago it happened. For the victim, it's as if it happened yesterday. It's still new and fresh for the victim. So what does that mean when they're trying to create distance between themselves and the incident by saying they keep stating it over and over again? And so the focus is the length of time in which it happened. And I think for me, maybe the implication is it's not happening today. There's nobody aggrieved today in the church for how abuse is dealt with. Now, members up and down this country know that that's not true, And so maybe something else, So what are we going to see in the way of responsibility? Are we saying we want resignations and we want people to resign and we want somebody to take responsibility? We know that there are different people perhaps in leadership today than was when that happened, for sure. But there are also people who have served since 2009 when the allegation went to the police again, and they advised the conferences again. So somebody knows something. So if they do not want to take leadership, responsibility, okay. If you do not want to fire anybody or force anybody to resign, but let us know what's happening. I think sometimes I wonder if they're kind of hiding on and in their offices, wondering when is this going to blow over and we can move on with business as usual. And I don't think that's going to happen. People are not going to move on and forget this really quickly. So we really need to see more. We need to see more happen. And so the incident, I just want to address the incident. It happened long ago. Or why didn't they say something? You hear this all the time. When a woman will disclose abuse and they say, well, why is she saying it now? She's been in that situation for 20 years, suffering, forgiving, learning how to live, but trauma doesn't work like that, right? And so why a victim who experienced abuse in childhood is disclosing when they're 50 and 60? Because that's the time they are disclosing. And what you don't do with victim is further victimize them. And so when we're asking the question, why have they taken so long? What we're doing is victim blaming. We're blaming the victim for their own abuse, and we're blaming them for taking long to tell us. The same people who are saying, why have they taken so long, is the same people who would not have believed had they disclosed earlier. Any earlier wouldn't have mattered. And so the time doesn't matter. So even sometimes when people disclose in families, people say, why didn't you tell me? Because the victim takes the time they take. They disclose when they disclose. Sexual abuse is not an easy thing to talk about. We see what's happening right now. We see the shaming. We see the questions that are dismissive. We see the responses that are not empathetic. That's what victims fear. And so that's why they don't disclose. That's why they haven't shared it before. That's one of the reasons why they haven't shared it before. And also, this man has a massive standing in church. He was charismatic. I'm hearing he was commanding in his presence. When he speaks, people listen. So if you're not as eloquent, if you do not have as many connections, if you do not have the reach that he has, who is going to believe you? That's often what victims say. Am I going to be believed when I disclose? We see one of the gentlemen on the Channel 4 News said, when the policeman said, I believe you, he wept. Did you see how he cried? He wept. He said, I didn't think that meant so much to him that the policeman said, I believe you. Just say, I believe you. And so that's why sometimes people don't talk. It's not the easiest subject to talk about. Our church, I know, because I've been doing the trauma-informed church for many years, I know it's not an easy place to bring our pain. Lots of pain in the pews that nobody's acknowledging, that we prefer not to see. And so when you're in an environment where everybody else is okay, there is no opening in that conversation to say, oh, guess what? I was abused by somebody in church. He's still preaching. He's still teaching. He's still traveling the world teaching. And therefore, this is the person. You feel that sometimes victims measure themselves and think, who is going to believe me? I am nobody. And he's something. Nobody would believe me. And oftentimes that's true. Right now, we're experiencing that. So right now, people are not saying we don't believe you. People are saying, why did you take so long? People are saying, well, it didn't happen at church. People are saying it happened in the 60s and 70s. It's the same thing as we didn't believe you, because we're still giving the victim responsibility. If they disclose when they were 15, it'd be, well, why did your mother send you? Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you scream in the room and run? Why didn't you say something when you came home? Sometimes there are people who are always going to blame the victim. So the time in which this was disclosed doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the time. People often blame victims. And so we want to avoid asking that question, why did they take so long? And maybe we're asking it for our satisfaction and for our curiosity, but it's hurtful to victims. It's not only hurtful to the victims who have disclosed and gone to the media, it's hurtful to victims right in your circle, right in your home, right in your families who have not yet disclosed, hearing you say, why did they take so long? They're watching how you deal with this situation, and they're learning that you're not somebody that they can disclose to. So they're going to keep it to themselves. And I think for people who have experienced pain for themselves and have done their work of healing, don't ask questions like that, because we just understand. We understand the magnitude of abuse, and we understand how hard a subject it is to talk about. We understand that not everybody's empathetic enough and have the level of compassion to hear our story. And so we won't tell our story. So that's why. I also, one of the things I know and maybe think about often is sometimes the victims were also protecting the church. Why did they take so long? They too were protecting the church. They knew and they've been schooled to protect the good name of the church. And they know that if they disclose and talk about abuse that has happened by an upstanding member of the church, the ridicule they would face, the lack of belief that they would face, the ostracizing that they would face. And so they didn't. They also worked to protect the good name of the church and not disclose earlier. So the next time you're curious, or the next time you're enraged because your church is in the media, and you are uncomfortable because your church is in the media, and you think one of the ways to manage your discomfort is by asking why now, just think about that. They were protecting the church just as much as you're enraged and wanted them to protect the church. And they protect the church at the expense of their own emotional well-being. They protect the church at the expense of their own physical well-being. And they did it until they couldn't do it any longer. So why did they go to the media? They did it until they couldn't do it any longer. They disclosed somebody in 2009, somebody a couple of years ago before the gentleman died. So why they go now? Sometimes people use it as an absolute last resort. It's not because they want anything. I mean, what could they gain by putting their face on national television, internationally, because it's been watched hundreds of thousands of times, right? When they put their face out there, they have nothing to gain. Anything they gain, if and I don't know if they gain anything monetarily, it is fail into when you weigh it up against what they didn't gain, what they've lost. So anybody who feel like maybe they're gaining monetarily from talking to the media, what these men have lost far outweigh anything that they could possibly have gained. And once again, I'm going to think it's people who have not had pain that they've healed that would think, oh, they're just getting something. They're not getting anything. They've lost everything. Sometimes they've lost their families. Some have lost their ability to have families, lost their ability to have a job and, keep regular employment. Their self-esteem, they've probably spent their whole lives trying to build self-esteem, their self-worth that has been trampled through the actions of this man that they're trying to regain. So nothing that they have gained, if they've gained anything, will compare to what they've lost. So let's bear that in mind when we're asking this question. And also, the incident didn't happen in church. And I addressed this, I think last week in the podcast. It didn't happen in church. Now, it didn't have to happen in church in order for us to have responsibility for it. And I gave this example. It's like one of my children harming each other out at college or at football. And they come home and say, Mom, my brother hurt me. Do I not deal with it because it didn't happen at home? Of course I do, because I'm responsible for both of them. And that's why they went to church. Because while maybe this man wasn't in leadership at the time, in leadership as in conference leadership, I believe he had church leadership, he wasn't in conference leadership. Because of that, in church leadership, he's upstanding. People know him. He's well respected. He's revered. So whenever he does anything, they go to church to think he has some responsibility. Now, what people needed from the church then and what they needed from the church now might be completely different. All sometimes victims need is for church to acknowledge, I believe you, you can't serve, we're going to send this report with you, other people are protected. Oftentimes that's enough because they know that their story's heard, it's believed, somebody responded. What do they need from the church now? Empathy, respect, I am sorry, an apology, some work of repair they want from the church now. But I think the leaders in the church are so busy hiding and afraid of, and I don't know if it's too late now, because somebody some years ago didn't respond empathetically and apologize and do any work of repair at all with the families. And now it's at a place where maybe the relationship has broken down. And once again, the relationship may have broken down and they don't have repair skills. So because the relationship have broken down, because of this, people have gone to the media, and now we're also going to blame them again for going to the media when a relationship has broken down. We don't know how long they've waited. We don't know how many stone walls they had to climb through to get to speak to anybody. We don't know how many times they were ghosted. I think, and I said this a couple of days ago, that sometimes pastoral care, really good pastoral care in this time might have worked. I don't know. It's many victims. And another thing, the knock-on effect of victims, where one person gets hurt and they hurt another person, and on and on. We don't know how far-reaching this man's abuse was throughout the church, and therefore the church has some responsibility. One of the things I thought about when people said, well, it didn't happen in the church premises and he wasn't employed by the church. I'm thinking of people who have different doctrinal beliefs in our church. They are not allowed to get a platform at all. They're not allowed to speak. And if they speak in ministries that are private and independent, it's made very clear that this person is not speaking on behalf of the church. And I think they can't disown Donald Kelly in death. They can't disown him because of what he had done. They have to take ownership because they didn't not platform him. He was around the world working for Adventist institutions. Many people know. Many people know. So we can't disown him now. Don't engage with the media. Protect the church. I talked about that we protect the church. We're all protecting the church. Here is some of the places where I see the differences that I want to speak to between the Church of England and the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the leadership. The bishops are calling for change. They're asking for resignations. They're saying who is responsible. One of the things we've heard from the Seventh-day Adventist Church leadership is nothing. Not one person has spoken. Silence. And maybe they are told to be silent. Maybe they're not told to speak up. One of the things I know about our good church is that we're really not good with social justice issues. We tend to ignore social justice issues. We tend to ignore issues where people are hurting. We ignore racism. We ignore, apartheid in South Africa. We have split churches. We are not really good with dealing with things like this. Our history is not excellent in dealing with things like this. We tend to, it's split and people make decisions and people are off. And so the fact that not one pastor has spoken up about this atrocity, not one has spoken up about the atrocity that was in the news, about the colossal impact of the pain on these men and the families, on their future, on the future that they could have had. Not one has spoken up. That's a massive difference that I've seen. Not one is, we don't know, maybe they're silently calling for change and are silently demanding explanations and are silently doing what they're doing. Maybe they're silently doing it. But because you're silently doing it, it leaves a gap for us to fill the space with our own stories. So if you are not silently doing it, and if you know that you're actively asking questions and you're demanding change and you're wanting to know what's going to be done next, let us know what you're doing, because we're losing faith in leadership. And when young people are leaving the church, we hear that young people are leaving the church, or we come up with all kinds of reasons why we think they're leaving the church, and none of it speaks to the lack of integrity that we're seeing trickling down. None of it speaks to lack of responsibility. None of it speaks to lack of accountability. And so we want to hear, what are they doing? So pastors are not speaking. When you're complicit, when you're silent, you're complicit. Your silence means you agree. Your silence don't tell us that you disagree. So those are some of the reasons I see. And also the difference between the safeguarding. I mentioned this earlier, that the safeguarding lead for the Church of England spoke to the news. The safeguarding, I don't know who the safeguarding lead is for the British Union Conference. That's important. That's something important. What are the learnings that have come as a result of this? What are the mistakes that you've identified and is going to address? How will we know when these are addressed, and how will we know what's going to be implemented as a result of it? What change is going to come in the organization as a result of this expose, and how will we know? We want to know that ignoring members and saying it didn't happen in our church, it was a long time ago, it didn't happen in your church, doesn't mean that people all over the British Isles and the world is not watching and wanting to know what's the learning. How are we going to learn? What are we going to learn from it? If you want to come on this podcast, the Stories That Shape Us podcast, you're open to come to the podcast. Let us talk about it. I guarantee you that I can hold your view and mine in the same space with respect and honor and compassion, so that we can talk to the people, so that they can hear. Though I will ask leadership hard questions, and I will demand change in terms of abuse. Women and children are becoming unalive as a result of abuse. It's a serious issue. And so, although I will speak to the seriousness of the issue because of the pain that I've seen over many years, because of the generational cycle of harm, the vulnerability in terms of mental health and physical health, I will not be disrespectful of leadership. I will ask questions. So if you want to come on the podcast, your safeguarding lead, let's talk about it. Let's talk about safeguarding. Let's talk about the changes that are happening as a result of. Let's talk about the mistakes that was made and the learning that has happened. Let's restore faith in the people because you choose to speak up. I'm open to having that conversation. One of the things that I keep calling for in my videos here and on the podcast and just on my videos on Wounds to Scars YouTube channel is a cultural shift that needs to happen in our church, in churches across the Christian community, a cultural shift around how abuse is dealt with. Though I talk about the resignations from the Church of England, is that enough? Perhaps not. Perhaps that's not enough. It's that's talking about accountability and somebody's taking accountability and responsibility. But will that create change? Maybe it won't create enough change in the beginning. But maybe, the resignations new people will come in, new mandates will be developed, new laws will be designed, new policies are tightened up. And so maybe through that change will come. But I know resignation on its own will not create any change. Sometimes, though, what people do is not resign. They move them on to somewhere else to create the same issue in another part of the church, in another part of the Christian community. So what we really need is a cultural shift. We need a cultural shift in the Christian community that is more focused on abuse prevention and awareness, abuse education. Lots of people are not educated around abuse. Lots of people do not know what the signs of abuse look like. Lots of people, even though there's a safeguarding policy, don't understand grooming, the importance of it, and how to look out for it in church. Lots of leadership in our church in the Christian community don't understand and know. There needs to be a cultural shift about prioritizing the needs of the organization over the people. The people make the organization, so there needs to be a shift in that. Let us focus on loving, nurturing, supporting people and not the good name of our churches, because I think God is able to look after the church, right? And, we are here, we are fulfilling the gospel commission in Matthew 24. We're going to all the nations and preaching, and we're teaching, baptizing, and we're letting people know that Jesus is coming and he's coming soon. That's our mandate more than anything else. Our mandate is not to protect the good name of the church. Our mandate is to preach and teach and let people know that Jesus is coming soon. But if we're not living the gospel, if we're not living that gospel that we're teaching, it's hollow. It won't have the impact and the effect that it should have. So that's really the things that we should be focused on, not the good name of the church. So this shift will focus on zero tolerance around abuse. We are not going to tolerate it. Everybody up and down in your church, every leader, regardless of how important their position, need to know that there's a zero tolerance around abuse. So that means when a woman discloses abuse, we are immediately going to activate things that is going to keep her safe. When a child discloses abuse, we are going to take the record and we're going to execute immediately. Now, we can't tell people there's a safeguarding policy, and when they report, nothing happens after that. People will stop reporting. They will not trust you to report to you, because when they report, nothing happened. So we need to have that zero tolerance. We need to have education and training for people to recognize the signs of abuse, signs of grooming, and know how to act. We need to have leadership that is prepared to answer and to take responsibility and to take accountability. We need to have, when failings happen, we need to have reviews that are done in an expeditious way, with recommendations, with learning outcomes, and the learning that are implemented straight away. And we need to have transparency and honesty. We need to see that across the Christian community. Not just, I know it's not just present in the Church of England and in the Adventist Church. Those are the two churches that are in the news at the moment, but I know it's not just present in those communities. So if you are listening to this and those are not your churches, and you're sitting and you're thinking, oh, well, at least it's not me. I think if my husband has this saying from where he's from that says, when somebody's house is on fire, wet yours. That means if somebody else is in trouble, look at your policies, look at what you are doing, look at the things and the changes that you need to make so that your church is not the next one in the news because you failed children and young people. For those who are in the news at the moment, what are the learning? How are the people in your church, the smallest church in the most remote place, going to be confident in your leadership anymore? And I want to speak to the members as well. We also have to stop protect perpetrators. I know it's not a leadership problem only. I know it's sometimes a Christian issue where we protect perpetrators and we blame victims. These victims that we see in the Channel 4 news are from the 60s and 70s. They're victims in your church right now that are also being victimized. We have to learn and understand what love looks like from Galatians 5:21 and 22. Practice that love so that we can be representative of Christ to the person that sits beside us in church and the person whom we've never met yet. The person who is going to watch the Channel 4 news wonder, will I go to that place? I do not want to go to a church where my children won't be safe, so that they can know that your church will be a safe place for them to worship. Thank you for joining me in this episode of the Stories That Shape Us podcast. I hope you'll join me on the next story.